Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the agreement that's been signed between Russia and Venezuela. And if you follow the channel, you'll be familiar with both of those countries. I've made a lot of videos about Russia, talking about the impact of the sanctions that have been applied against Russia since its invasion of Ukraine started back in February 2022. And it's actually the most sanctioned country in the history of the world. It's currently facing around 20 different rounds of sanctions from the USA and Europe, and they are very comprehensive. And probably the second most sanctioned country in the history of the world is Venezuela, because they've been facing severe sanctions since Nicolas Maduro, the current president, took over. And it's struggling in terms of developing its oil industry. It's seen a complete collapse over the course of the last 10 years of both its oil industry in terms of production and all of its equipment, and also the revenue that Venezuela has been earning, and therefore the GDP of the country has also crashed. We've seen hyperinflation in Venezuela, and we've got around 76% of the population are now classified as living in poverty. So in today's video, I want to go through the details of this deal that's been agreed between Russia and Venezuela, talk about what's in it for both countries, why they've actually signed this agreement, and what potentially might happen, whether or not this will enable Venezuela to turn the corner, or if this is just going to be another historic event that doesn't really lead to a lot in terms of capital. Now, in terms of the meeting itself, it was held in Moscow, and you can see here the meeting was very formal. We've got the guys who are saluting President Putin as he walks into the room. You can see it's quite a big size differential between Nicolas Maduro and President Putin, and then they go around and shake everybody's hands before they eventually sit down to start talking Turkey and agree the deal that we're now going to talk about. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves out of every country in the world. You can see here that I've put together a table showing the top 10. It has proven oil reserves of over 300 billion barrels. That is a huge amount of oil. Now, not all of that oil is going to be easy to extract, and it is quite thick and difficult to actually refine. But just in terms of pure supply, Venezuela has the most, and therefore you would have expected it to be one of the richest nations in the world. But as you can see on the right-hand side here, I've put the daily production, the current estimated levels that each country is producing here. And you can see that out of the 10 countries in this top 10, Venezuela is by far the smallest producer. It's producing less than 1 million barrels of oil per day. And we'll have a look at what's happened in the history of Venezuela's oil production and talk about why that's happened. The country with the second largest oil reserves is Saudi Arabia, with just under 300 billion barrels, and it's producing almost 9 million barrels per day. So that's 10 times the amount that Venezuela is producing, even though it's got slightly less reserves. Iran's number 3 on the list with over 200 million barrels, but it's only producing 4 million compared to Saudi Arabia's 9 million. And part of the reason for that is because Iran itself is also facing some severe sanctions. Canada has the 4th largest reserves with just under 170 billion barrels, and it's producing around about 6 million barrels per day. Iraq comes in at number 5 with 145 billion barrels, and it's producing around 4 million a day. The UAE, number 6 with 113, followed by Kuwait with just over 100, and then Russia comes in at number 8 with around 80 billion barrels worth of oil under the ground. And interestingly, it's pulling out over 10 million barrels per day. So that's quite a large extraction rate when you compare the amount of oil that Russia has with a lot of these other countries. The United States is in at number 9 with over 50 billion barrels, and that estimate changes depending on what's happening with the shale oil, but it's producing the most out of any country in the world, over 13.5 million barrels of oil per day. And Libya comes in at number 10 with just under 50 billion barrels, but it's only producing around 1 million. So similar to Venezuela, albeit it has a lot less oil. The key terms of the deal signed between President Putin and Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela are as follows. The main focus is on energy and natural resources, not surprisingly, because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. So, in order for Russia to actually want to do something, there needs to be something in it for Russia. And obviously, the access to that huge amount of oil is a potential attraction. And you can see that as part of the deal, Russia and Venezuela have agreed to joint ventures in oil and gas exploration and development. Now, this is key from Venezuela's point of view because whilst they've got all of this oil and gas sitting under the ground, that's not actually any good to Venezuela if you can't extract it. And Venezuela simply doesn't have the capital or the partnerships to be able to afford to do it at the moment. That's why the production has been falling over the past 20 years, and that's why the economy is in the toilet. So it needs a strategic partner to come in and be happy to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to help it develop it to a world-class industry. And Russia is saying that it wants to do that. It wants to expand its oil trading operations and then establish a collaboration within OPEC and the Gas Exporting Countries Forum to promote stable global energy markets and oppose unfair competition. Which is interesting because OPEC itself is actually designed to go against fair competition because it tends to control the supply of oil to influence the price. And historically, what it's done mostly is reduce the supply at times when prices are falling so that the price will go back up. So it's an interesting statement. But also, Russia wants to develop electric power infrastructure and cooperate in mineral extraction and metallurgy. So essentially, what we're seeing here is Russia signing up to help Venezuela develop all of its natural resources, to exploit those resources and start to monetize them. And obviously, there will be a revenue sharing agreement in place between Russia and Venezuela for doing that. Now, interestingly, as well as oil and gas and other minerals, they've also said that on defense and security, Russia wants to strengthen military technical cooperation to enhance defense capabilities for Venezuela. And there'll be a joint effort to combat terrorism, extremism, and falsification of history. So Russia, alongside the commercial side of things, is now wanting to team up from a security and defense perspective, which is interesting given the fact that Venezuela is located in South America, which is relatively close to North America, to USA. Now, from an economic perspective, Russia has said that they want to promote joint investments in sectors like mining, telecommunications, and transportation. So this is really going to be a one-way agreement. Venezuela is not going to be investing anything into Russia. This is all going to be Russia investing into Venezuela. And also the development of an independent financial infrastructure to facilitate trade and investment without relying on Western systems. So what this is referring to is Russia establishing its payment systems, which it's been using and it's been trying to use in competition against all of the Western systems that it's got kicked out of. So when the sanctions were applied against Russia, it was banned from the SWIFT payment system, which is the one that's used predominantly by financial markets to make large payments. So Russia is trying to set up something to compete with that. And on that front, we see at the bottom here that Russia wants enhanced coordination at the United Nations and other international platforms. Okay. United opposition to unilateral sanctions. So basically, that's where both Venezuela and Russia are facing sanctions from a particular party, such as the USA. Then they're going to team up to basically oppose that. And then I think, interestingly, at the bottom here, we've got Venezuela's support to join the BRICS bloc and integration in the Eurasian Economic Union. So BRICS is the collaboration that Russia has pulled together. It's referred to as BRICS because the original members were Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But there's actually been a number of other countries that have joined in. If we have a look at this chart, you can see that the official list currently includes Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia. Saudi Arabia was invited and initially said that it was going to join as a full member, but then subsequently decided it didn't want to. And in addition to the full members, there are also partner members. We've got Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. So Venezuela will be added to that list. We don't know whether they're going to be a partner country or a full member country. My guess is that they'll probably be a partner country because they don't have a lot of capital to be able to put in. They've got oil, which obviously they could then open up to these other BRICS members to help them develop, which Russia has already signed up to. Maybe some of these others will as well. I know China have been talking to Venezuela about partnerships and trying to develop their infrastructure, but they haven't committed to anything. But it's interesting that Russia wants to bring Venezuela into the BRICS agreement to try to increase this list, because this essentially is in competition with the established nations of the West. Now, I mentioned the fact that Venezuela is the second most sanctioned country in the world after Russia. And this table gives a summary of the main sanctions that have been applied against Venezuela over the past 20 years. And you can see that there have been a number of different rounds of these sanctions. And on the left hand side, the sanctioning entity, you can see that the majority of these sanctions have been applied by the United States. So it isn't a genuine global sanction that's been applied. It's not the same as what Russia is facing, albeit the European Union have also provided a number of different sanctions relating predominantly to arms, internal repression, and humanitarian issues that are going on within Venezuela. They've also then followed up with some other sanctions in line with the USA on Nicolas Maduro's election campaigns, because he's been accused of rigging those votes, that it wasn't a true and fair election process. But the reason for showing this really is just to highlight the fact that Venezuela has faced sanctions for a variety of different reasons. And those sanctions have been targeted against all different parts of Venezuela. But probably the most damaging is against PDVSA, which is the state-owned oil company that, when Venezuela took over all of the assets from overseas oil businesses back around 40, 50 years ago, that's the company that was established. That's the company that owns all of the oil extraction in Venezuela. And the fact that it's been sanctioned means that it struggles to be able to legitimately sell all of its oil. And the problem that that then brings with it is that oil majors don't want to go to Venezuela and invest to actually try to help develop the production, because they know that those sales are going to be limited. But also because of the history whereby Venezuela nationalized a lot of the oil industry, there's a concern that if you invest tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into setting up new facilities, that Venezuela could actually turn around and say, thank you very much, we'll now keep that for ourselves, and you don't get anything going forward. So we've got a number of different factors, partly related to the sanctions and partly related to the seizure of the assets in the past, that are preventing major investment into Venezuela. And as a result of that, we've seen a huge impact on a Venezuelan economy. This graph shows Venezuelan oil production between 2005 and 2025, and the scale on the left-hand side of this chart shows the number of barrels of oil per day in millions. And you can see that back in 2005, Venezuela was producing around 3.3 million barrels of oil per day. And if you take a step back, you can see that that was actually the high point for the Venezuelan oil industry. Since that time, there has been a steady and fairly rapid decline. And I plotted a number of different points on this chart. Firstly, when Nicolas Maduro took over as president in 2013, so the previous president died and Maduro was voted in. He was one of his right-hand men. And you can see that there was no change in terms of production, in terms of that he didn't manage to arrest the decline that had been going on for the previous 8 years or so. And then we saw a change in terms of when the USA applied sanctions in 2017 against PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. There was a sharp decline in production. As I said earlier, one of the reasons for that was, firstly, US companies that were involved in the Venezuelan oil industry pulled out at that time, but it also meant that the other oil majors also decided that they didn't want to be investing into Venezuela, because when you think about the oil industry, in terms of major production, there aren't that many players. It's an oligopoly, basically. So you've got a handful of really large companies that can invest hundreds of millions of dollars into this sort of industry. And when you're being hit with sanctions by the USA, that tends to scare people away. We then saw production hitting a record low in 2020. And that was actually before the COVID-19 pandemic, so it wasn't anything to do with a drop in global oil demand. However, that record low proved not to be the record low because we had a new low in 2023. So you can see that the industry basically went down from 3.3 million barrels of oil per day to 500,000. That is a complete collapse. Now, in 2023, there was actually some positive things happened where Chevron, that had been one of the companies that was investing into Venezuela before all of the assets were nationalized, was actually given a license to continue extracting oil to try and pay back some of the money that it was owed. And so that was under the Joe Biden administration. So that actually increased the production slightly. It didn't quite get back to 1 million barrels per day, but it certainly increased quite significantly from 500,000. However, that license has now been revoked by Donald Trump, so it looks like Chevron won't be extending their relationship with Venezuela. And I've put on here the strategic partnership with Russia, which we'll go on to talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. And in terms of the highlights, to summarize what's happened with the Venezuelan oil industry, the problems that they have is that a lot of the equipment is now old and decrepit and it hasn't been replaced. So Venezuela hasn't been reinvesting into its industry. That was one of the problems even back in 2005, that the government was running it for cash. It was running it as a cash cow, running it down, not taking the profit and then reinvesting back into new equipment and making sure that everything was going to last for a long period of time. They basically were pumping as much oil as they could using older and older equipment. And the problem with that is at some point when it starts breaking down, you're going to have severe problems. And that's basically the situation that Venezuela finds itself in today. It hasn't reinvested and nobody wants to put up hundreds of millions of dollars to start making that equipment work more efficiently because they're not going to see a return on it. This chart plots Venezuela's GDP between 2005 and 2024, and the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in billions of US dollars. You can see that back in 2005, GDP was sitting at around 150 billion. And between 2005 and 2010, there was actually a sharp increase in GDP, and it got up to just under $400 billion. And as I said, that was the period when Venezuela was basically milking its oil industry as much as it could. So it was producing as much as the equipment would allow it to without reinvesting any of that money back into making sure that that equipment was going to last for the next 50 to 100 years. So at some point, obviously, that's going to break down, and that's what started happening in terms of the reduction in the output. And then also we had the impact of the financial sanctions. So you can see that between 2010 and 2017, which is when the sanctions started to hit, there was a significant fall in GDP. By 2017, it was down to around 220 billion US dollars from that high of 400. However, once the sanctions hit, the fall accelerated, and by 2020, GDP had fallen to 100 billion. So it was basically less than where it had been back in 2005. Now, over the past few years, because of that license that was granted to Chevron, and some investment went back into the industry, which allowed production of oil to start increasing again. And also, Venezuela benefits from the fact that oil prices rose significantly following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the oil that it did have became more valuable. And so by 2024, GDP had got broadly back to where it was in 2005, around $150 billion. But you can see overall here the devastating impact that both the decline in the oil industry within Venezuela, partly because companies don't want to invest into Venezuela because of that nationalization issue and also the sanctions, has led to a dramatic fall in GDP. And Venezuela today is back to where it was 20 years ago. This table shows the average rate of inflation in Venezuela between 2005 and 2024. Now, the reason that I've shown this as a table rather than a graph, because I like a graph and I know everybody loves to look at the graphs, but the problem when you're plotting a graph for figures like this is that the scale becomes too difficult to actually squeeze everything into, because some inflation over the last 20 years in Venezuela has been off the scale. So if we look back in 2005, inflation was running That's over 14%, which from the Western world's perspective is extremely high. But we're talking about a country that's developing an emerging economy. It's in South America. So 14%, whilst it is very high, is not unusual for those sort of economies. However, you can see that between 2005 and 2008, inflation doubled to more than 30%. So 30% is seriously high. That's getting into dangerous territory. And it stayed around about 30%, 25, 30% through to 2011. It got down to 20% in 2012, but then started to take off in 2013 when Nicolas Maduro took over as the president. So this was the period when the oil industry was struggling. So it was producing as much as it could, but each year it was producing less and less, which meant there was less revenue going into the economy. There was less GDP. We saw the dramatic fall in GDP. And you can see that the impact on inflation was devastating. And then when the sanctions came along in 2017, it made things worse. So between 2013 and 2017, inflation increased from 56%, which would have put it as one of the highest in the world at that time, to 275% in 2016. It then jumped to 862% in 2017. And then in 2018, we had hyperinflation. So this is when prices basically just keep going and going and going. And the official average rate of inflation in 2018 was over 130,000%. So that's why I can't plot this as a graph, because you would need to have a scale from 0 to 130,000, and then all of the figures below 130,000 would basically be a flat line across the bottom virtually, and then you'd have this huge spike. So that's why I'm showing it as a table. But 130,000% inflation is obviously, you can't even think about what that means in price terms. If you think that something you're buying today for $1 next year would cost $130,000, that really doesn't make any sense, does it? Because then that means that everything is costing a ludicrous amount. You just can't pay for those sort of things. It basically means that your currency is completely redundant. You have to then start using other people's currencies. So the US dollar is the obvious choice in situations like this. You get a high level of dollarization when you have inflation running at 60 or 70%, but at 130%, basically, you're going to have to cancel your currency and start again. And that's basically what Venezuela had to do. In 2019, they managed to bring it down to just under 10,000%, which is a lot better than 130,000, but obviously 10,000% inflation is still out of control. In 2020, it was down to just under 3,000%, so quite a lot better than it had been, but still ridiculous. 2021, 686%, still ridiculously high. 2022, 234%. 2023, 130%. And then the official rate in 2024 is 47%. But we don't get reliable figures coming out of Venezuela. We don't get monthly public data that we can look at, and we can't see exactly what's going on. But as I said at the start of today's video, it was recently estimated that over 75% of the Venezuelan population are living in poverty. So that basically means that they're struggling to be able to buy enough food to put on the table for their families. And one of the reasons for that is because of what's been happening with inflation. And this inflation data really tells us that the Venezuelan economy is broken. And at the moment, it doesn't look like there's any way of fixing it. However, this deal with Russia could be the hope that Venezuela have been waiting for. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think this latest announcement of the 10-year deal between Russia and Venezuela is really quite interesting, because obviously Russia has been suffering badly over the past 3 years as a result of the severe financial sanctions that have been applied against it as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. And whilst when Donald Trump first came into power, it looked like there might be a swift conclusion to the war, and potentially that could have been in Russia's favour if there was a swift deal, because it's unlikely that President Putin was going to agree to give back all of the land that's being occupied by Russian forces. So it looked like there may have been a deal in the offing. However, the longer things go on, it looks less and less likely that that deal is going to be signed, and it might be that the war just carries on going. So those sanctions could remain in place for the foreseeable future, if not forever, from Russia's perspective, if a deal is not agreed. So Russia is now trying to develop its relationships outside of the alliances that have been set up historically by the West. And Venezuela is an attractive partner because historically it's a communist country, so it has the same sort of historic ideology as Russia. So it's in the same bracket, but also it has the largest oil supplies in the world. But it's not just oil that Venezuela has, it also has gas and a variety of other really valuable minerals. So Russia has now come out and signed this 10-year agreement to help Venezuela develop all of those minerals. It wants to go and send lots of people and invest lots of money into developing the industry. But the big question is, can Russia afford to do that? Does it have sufficient capital to be able to start investing into Venezuela? And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I'm not entirely sure that it does, because Russia has been using its national wealth fund, it's basically its piggy bank, to keep the war in Ukraine going. It's been running a deficit in every year since it's invaded Ukraine, and that deficit is actually getting larger. And one of the problems that Russia is facing right now is that oil prices have been in decline for the last 12 months. They've come down from a high following Russia's immediate invasion of Ukraine of around $120 per barrel to around $60. So we've seen a halving in the price of oil, and that, generally speaking, would mean that your revenue would also fall by about 50%. However, the situation has been worse for Russia because the sanctions has meant that they've had to sell their oil at a discount to market prices to encourage people to buy it. Because if you're paying market price, you'd buy oil that doesn't have any problems, it doesn't have any sanctions associated with it. So in order to encourage people to buy your oil, you have to give them a discount, and that's what Russia has been doing. So Russia currently is seeing the amount of revenue it's earning going down, and it's also seeing its savings account going down. So this doesn't really look like a time when Russia would want to start investing into other countries. It needs to keep investing into its own oil and gas production facilities in order to keep its production high. But I think one of the clues here as to why Russia wants to sign this strategic deal is because Russia has an estimated reserve of around 80 billion barrels of oil under the ground, whereas Venezuela has around 300 billion. Now, some of that oil is difficult to extract and difficult to refine, so we're not comparing like for like. However, it still does have large supplies, and so in the long term, it could prove highly valuable from Russia's perspective. Now, how much it will actually prove to be worth to Venezuela in the short term remains to be seen. However, I would be surprised if Russia starts investing huge amounts into Venezuela within the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, because it doesn't really know what's going on with its own budget because of the war in Ukraine. But I wanted to post this video because I think this agreement that's been signed is interesting. It's showing that the BRICS countries are continuing to try to build their alliance. They're trying to build something that would truly compete with the West. However, the problem that it's had is that there's been a lot of disagreement between the major countries. So Russia, China, India have been struggling to agree in terms of what they should be doing, what currency they should be using. There was talk at one point of having a BRICS currency that hasn't come to fruition. And I think over the long term, it will be interesting to see whether or not BRICS does develop into a genuine strategic alliance that benefits all of the countries, or if it's just a concept that never really comes to fruition. But the overall summary of today's video is that Venezuela has struggled badly over the past 20 years. It's seen its oil industry go seriously into decline. Its revenues have fallen. Inflation has gone through the roof. The people in Venezuela have suffered badly. Over 3/4 of them are now in poverty. It's a country in a desperate state that needs some help. Russia have come along and said, we will help. They've signed a 10-year agreement. However, the question remains as to whether or not Russia can afford to follow through with that deal. Does it have the capital available to be able to bring the Venezuelan oil industry up to current standards? Or is this just going to be a notional agreement that doesn't really lead to a great deal from Venezuela's perspective? So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that support. And here's something to put a smile on your face.